For the history, introduction of Turkish poetry covering all eras, see Turkish literature. Poetry of the Republic of Turkey covers the Turkish poetry, beginning with 1911 with the national literature movement. In the early years of the Republic of Turkey, there were a number of poetic trends. Authors such as Ahmed, Hâşim and Yahyâ Kemâl Beyatlı continued to write important formal verse whose language was, to a great extent, a continuation of the late Ottoman tradition. By far the majority of the poetry of the time, however, was in the tradition of the folk-inspired syllabist movement, which had emerged from the national literature movement and which tended to express patriotic themes couched in the syllabic meter associated with Turkish folk poetry. The first radical step away from this trend was taken by Nazim Hikmet, who, during his time as a student in the Soviet Union from 1921 to 1924, was exposed to the modernist poetry of Vladimir Mayakovsky and others, which inspired him to start writing verse in a less formal style. At this time, he wrote the poem Akların Gözbebekleri, which introduced free verse into the Turkish language for, essentially, the first time. Much of Nazim Hikmet's poetry subsequent to this breakthrough would continue to be written in free verse, though his work exerted little influence for some time due largely to censorship of his work owing to his communist political stance, which also led to his spending several years in prison. Over time, in such books as Simavna Kadisioglu Seyh Bedrettin Dastani and Memleketimden İnsan Manzaraları, he developed a voice simultaneously proclamatory and subtle. Another revolution in Turkish poetry came about in 1941 with the publication of a small volume of verse preceded by an essay and entitled Garip. The authors were Orhan Veli-Kanık, Melih Servetli, and Oktay Rifat, explicitly opposing themselves to everything that had gone in poetry before. They sought instead to create a popular art, to explore the people's tastes, to determine them, and to make them reign supreme over art. To this end, and inspired in part by contemporary French poets like Jacques Prévert, they employed not only a variant of the free verse introduced by Nazim Hikmet, but also highly colloquial language, and wrote primarily about mundane daily subjects and the ordinary man on the street. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Most of the academic establishment and older poets vilified them, while much of the Turkish population embraced them wholeheartedly, though the movement itself lasted only 10 years, until Orhan Veli's death in 1950, after which Melih Servetli and Oktay Rifat moved on to other styles. Its effect on Turkish poetry continues to be felt today. Just as the Garip movement was a reaction against earlier poetry, so, in the 1950s and afterwards, was there a reaction against the Garip movement. The poets of this movement, soon known as İkinci Yeni, opposed themselves to the social aspects prevalent in the poetry of Nazim Hikmet and the Garip poets, and instead, partly inspired by the disruption of language in such Western movements as Dada and Surrealism, sought to create a more abstract poetry, through the use of jarring and unexpected language, complex images, and the association of ideas. To some extent, the movement can be seen as bearing some of the characteristics of postmodern literature. The most well-known poets writing in the second new vein were Turgut Uyar, Edip Cansevat, Semel Şuraya, Ece Sezai Karakoç and İlhan Bey. Outside of the Garip and second new movements also, a number of significant poets have flourished, such as Faisal Hüsnü Daglıca, who wrote poems dealing with fundamental concepts like life, death, God, time, and the cosmos. Behzat Nekatical, whose somewhat allegorical poems explore the significance of middle-class daily life. Can Yücel, who, in addition to his own highly colloquial and varied poetry, was also a translator into Turkish of a variety of world literature. Garrett movement, Orhan Velikanık, Oktay Rifat Horozcu, Melih Servetande, free verse, Nazim Hikmet, second new movement, Semel Şuraer, İlhan Berk, Turkish Yahyâ, Edip Kanzva, İyhan Kagla, Sezai Karakok, Alred Nazid Noran, Tevfik Akdag, Alkutema, others, Nazan Tevfik poet, Ahmed Hâşim poet, Yahyâ Kemâl Beyatlı poet, Abdülhak Hissa poet and novelist, Orhan Seyfi Orhan poet, Enes Bahig Korurik poet, Halit Fari Ozanse poet, Yusuf Ziraortak poet, Muammer Lutfi Baksi poet, Nesip Fazil Kisakurik poet and essayist, Vasfi Mahir Kokalurik poet, Sabri Isat Sayavaskal poet, Sevdet Kudret poet, Yazan Arbinaya poet and journalist, Ahmet Mahip Duranas poet, Kahit Sidki Tarashi poet, Zia Osman Sabah poet, Faisal Husnu Daglika poet, Fag Basil poet, Salah Bursal poet, Ojdemir Asaf poet, N. Abisaya poet and novelist, Can Yücel poet, Attila İlhan poet, Servet Kapan poet, Güven Turan poet, İsmet Özel poet, Sabit Inst poet, Sem Uzungunes poet, Hakan Sersel poet and novelist, Aladin Kalkariglu poet, Seyhan Kurt poet and sociologist, Mehmet Altan poet, Eris Honor poet, author, Mehmet Erte poet, Kukuk Iskandar poet, folk, Faruk Nafiz Kamlibel poet,